When government-run schools teach that the American Revolution was mostly or completely about taxation without representation, the underlying message that kids are getting taught, I think, is pretty clear. It may not be spoken of, but it certainly is there. Today, we have representatives, so if you don't like what they do, just find new ones. That's the solution to everything. But this ignores a deeper cause, and of course a solution, a deeper cause of the American Revolution behind that taxation without representation cry, a centuries-old system called mercantilism. Murray Rothbard, who we should all at least read and know, described it like this: a system of statism using economic fallacy to build up imperial power through monopolies and special privileges. Sounds pretty familiar to what we live under today. Anyways, this was a huge part of the real foundation of colonial grievances long before the Stamp Act and taxes on tea ever sparked broader resistance and calls for independence. So on this episode, I've got all the goods, plus some surprising insights from both Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who viewed not just internal taxes from the British as usurpations of power as unconstitutional, but the entire mercantilist system, the regulation and controls and prohibitions of international trade. They saw it as interfering with natural rights to free trade. I'll get to all that in just a moment, but first of all, welcome, and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, August 19th, 2024. Hope you had an awesome weekend. Got a lot of info to share with you today, so let's dive right into it. Hear from a new article by Mike Meharry, Mercantilism and the Road to the American Revolution. He said this system called mercantilism, well, it's kind of a crony capitalist, what we call it today, was a dominant economic theory in Europe from the 16th to the 18th century. It used state power in attempt to accumulate wealth for the nation and its favored businesses. And Mike points out that one of the key principles of mercantilism was maintaining a positive balance of trade with more exports than imports. To this end, government aggressively intervened in the economy by levying high tariffs, restricting trade with various countries, or totally prohibiting it as well, as we'll see in the Declaration of Independence at the end, granting monopolies, and subsidizing favored industries. Again, this all sounds quite familiar. And I think that first quote from Rothbard is worth repeating. It's a system of statism using economic fallacy to build up imperial power through monopolies and special privileges. It's a great description of the largest government in history that we live under once again today. But Rothbard continues with this. But mercantilism cannot be viewed satisfactorily as merely an exercise in economic theory. It's not just an economic system that, you do tariffs and restrictions on trade. It's about political power, really. He said the mercantilist writers indeed did not consider themselves economic theorists, but practical men of affairs who argued and pamphleteered for specific economic policies, generally for policies which would subsidize activities or companies in which those writers were interested. I could say this a zillion times a day. It sounds familiar. Let's leave it at that, and hopefully I won't keep saying that through the show. Rothbard continues. Thus, a policy of favoring exports and penalizing imports had two important practical effects. It subsidized merchants and manufacturers engaged in the export trade and threw up a wall of privilege around inefficient manufacturers who formerly had to compete with foreign rivals. At the same time, the network of regulation and its enforcement built up the state bureaucracy as well as national and imperial power. It violated all kinds of rights. Anyways, Meharry says colonialism. This is a part of having colonies. This was a big part of the British mercantilist system. This is a small island. They had to rely on other areas to provide raw materials. And Mike says colonies were often established to serve merely as a source of raw materials that could be shipped to the mother country, where they were formed into finished manufactured goods. There were times where they even, as we'll get to here in a little bit, they passed laws to prevent them from turning things into finished goods in the colonies. So they had to be shipped back and then shipped back to the colonies in order to be purchased at a higher price. This is a total scratch my back political situation. And Mike says this is just how the British generally treated its colonies for over a century. We're talking way before the Stamp Act in 1765. And he says taxation without representation was part of a much broader and long-standing mercantilist economic policy the British imposed on the colonies. And Rothbard starts out with the famous Navigation Acts, and that's what we'll get to here in just a moment. He said they played a leading role in provoking the American Revolution. They're an excellent example of the structure and purpose of mercantilist regulations. This is a series of trade regulations and total prohibitions that were enacted over a number of laws from 1651 through around 1696. Of course, there are other mercantilist policies that we'll get to in a little bit as well that go after that. But Rothbard continues. He said the network of restriction generally greatly penalized Dutch and other European shippers, as well as American shipping and manufacturing, for the benefit of English merchants and manufacturers, whose competition was either outlawed or severely taxed and crippled. The power to tax is the power to destroy. Of course, we know taxation is theft. That's another episode. Rothbard continues, the use of the state to cripple or prohibit one's competition is, in effect, the grant by the state of monopolistic privilege, and such was the effect for Englishmen engaged in the colonial trade. So, for instance, we have the Navigation Act of 1651. It prohibited both the import and export of salted fish in foreign ships. There are certain trade regulations on the books today in the United States where, well, they could only use certain ships to go into certain ports, and then that makes it more restrictive. It's a kind of a copy of the British. I think it's the Jones Act. Other early navigation acts also mandated that certain products like sugar, tobacco, cotton, wool, indigo, ginger, etc., could only be shipped to England or other British colonies. So if you wanted to export goods, you could only ship it to England. And then England, the merchants there, if they wanted to ship it to another country, if they wanted to export it, it could go from there. So it added a layer of cost to everyone. Now, when most people talk about the American Revolution, a lot of people seem to believe that all of the colonists were okay with external regulations and external taxes and external trade, and the resistance really only started with the Stamp Act of 1765 because it was an internal tax. And of course, we know certainly Patrick Henry and the Loyal Nine, the Sons of Liberty up in Boston, Patrick Henry down in Virginia and elsewhere, John Dickinson in Pennsylvania, Delaware. They were certainly opposed to that as well, but there was broad opposition to acts for over a century as well. And Thomas Jefferson absolutely disagreed with the notion that it was just the internal taxes that were a problem. Here's how he put it in 1774, in a very important document almost never covered, a summary view of the rights of British America. He said that the exercise of a free trade with all parts of the world possessed by the American colonists as of natural right, and which no law of their own had taken away or abridged, was the next object of unjust encroachment. He's discussing all the issues already in 1774. It's almost like a list of grievances for the Declaration of Independence. He goes through act by act by act, discussing all these things. And he does go all the way back to 1651. And he says, this arbitrary act, however, soon they recalled and by solemn treaty entered into on the 12th day of March, 1651. This is just before the Navigation Act, between the said Commonwealth by their commissioners and the colony of Virginia by their House of Burgesses, it was expressly stipulated by the 8th article of the treaty. So there's a treaty signed saying that they should have, quote, free trade as the people of England do enjoy to all places and with all nations according to the laws of that Commonwealth. So he's pointing out, like, look, we made an agreement that we're going to have the same natural right to free trade. And we know there's some back and forth with who's on the throne around this time. And you got one dude and another and things change. But we have a deal, and you don't have power over us, is what Jefferson is saying. He went on to explain that the problem wasn't just the duties, of course. It wasn't just the taxation, but also the regulations and the restrictions in general in the Navigation Acts. He referred to it specifically as tyranny. He said, upon the restoration of His Majesty King Charles II, their rights of free commerce fell once again more a victim to arbitrary power. Arbitrary power, one of those injuries and usurpations in the Declaration of Independence, restrictions on trade as well. He said, and by several acts of his reign, and the footnote specifically points to a number of things like the Navigation Act of 1651, as well as some of his successors, the trade of the colonies was laid under such restrictions as show what hopes they might form from the justice of a British Parliament were its uncontrolled power admitted over these states. So he's saying, we recognized all along that you were exercising power that you shouldn't exercise. You are restricting something that we have an agreement on, that we've always had a natural right to do, and now you're saying we can't. And you've been doing this for quite a long time. And it's a great example of what would happen if Parliament ever claimed more power over the colonies than they did previously. And of course, by 1774, that was already happening pretty widely. Jefferson points out that history has informed us that bodies of men, as well as individuals, are susceptible of the spirit of tyranny. No doubt. A view of these acts of Parliament for regulation, as it has been affectedly called. And that's what they always say. Oh, we're going to regulate trade. We're going to make it, more fair, more equal. We're going to control prices, whatever it may be. All these rules that we see today, there are precursors to many of them from the British Empire. And of course, the Jeffersonians, the Madisonians, and the old revolutionaries, they revolted against it in many ways. He said, they call it regulation. He said, if all other evidence were removed out of the case, would undeniably evince the truth of this observation, that it is a tyranny, and if they exercise that kind of power over us on everything, which they certainly started doing with the Stamp Act, Sugar Act, and other things, the Tea Act, etc., it was going to be absolutely terrible. So here are a few other examples of these mercantilist policies that Jefferson and others were opposing, and we'll see how they were resisted pretty widely as well. We are all aware of John Hancock and smuggling probably during the American Revolution, but it was pretty widespread, and it was seen as an honorable trade, especially in the face of an empire that was trying to violate your rights. So the Wool Act of 1698, it prohibited the export of woolen products to any destination outside the colony in which they were produced, including other British colonies. It was intended to, basically prevent the colonies from being able to compete with British production. So if you produced wool, cotton, in the United States in the 17th century, you weren't able to export it anywhere. You couldn't export woolen products. Then we also have the Molasses Act of 1733, and that's where Parliament added a very high tax on molasses, sugar, and rum imported into the colonies from non-British colonies. The tax was designed to make sugar, as Mike points out, sugar and rum produced in the British West Indies cheaper compared with foreign products. In practice, it granted a de facto monopoly to British producers, so restricting people's free choice, giving a monopoly to certain producers, even if they don't do a good job. Then we have something that I think most people have never heard of, the Hat Act of 1732. It depends on how you listen. A lot of these things were passed by Parliament the previous year and given royal assent the following year. So on Wiki, they call it the Hat Act of 1731. We call it the Hat Act of 1732 when it went into effect. And it placed limits on the manufacture, sale, and exportation of colonial-made hats. Seems kind of innocuous. I think a lot of people today would say, oh, you're just restricting hats. That can't be a huge deal. Wait till you hear what Thomas Jefferson had to say about it. But because, as Meharry points out, this caused as much... It caused as much as a 4 times price increase for hats and cloth imported from Britain because you could make something locally with your own fur, which is, part of the rich tradition of the people in the American colonies. Now, suddenly they can't do it starting in 1732, and so they have to import things. A lot of people had to wear hats. It also restricted hiring practices by limiting the number of workers that hat makers could employ, so in other words, to restrict their output, and it placed the limits on apprenticeships by allowing only 2 of them. Thomas Jefferson called this an act of despotism, maybe one of the worst ones they had ever seen. And again, here from his summary view in 1774, he said, by an act passed in the 5th year of the reign of his late Majesty King George II, this is the Hat Act, an American subject is forbidden to make a hat for himself of the fur which he has taken perhaps on his own soil. An instance of despotism to which no parallel can be produced in the most arbitrary ages of British history. So merely claiming that something you capture or produce on your own land from your own, like you created this thing, you grew it, you built it, you may have grown plants, whatever it may be. You captured fur, you got some fur from your own land. You can't actually make it and sell it. Thomas Jefferson considered that one of the greatest acts of despotism, because if individuals are free to mix with the land, do what they are with their own property, they don't really have any self-ownership if someone outside can tell you what you can do with it like that. I know we all have many examples of how that type of thing plays out in modern times. We also have the Iron Act of 1750, or 1749, I guess this time. It restricted the establishment of new iron mills and steel furnaces in the American colonies. This was to restrict manufacturing capabilities to keep the colonies as just a supplier of raw materials to pump up the domestic manufacturing capabilities in the mainland in England. And Meharry points out that this policy forced the colonies to export raw iron to Britain, where it was forged into finished goods. Those goods were then shipped back to the colonies at a higher cost than if they had been produced domestically. It sounds absurd, but people with power don't care about how absurd something might be or how it might impact people, rich and poor alike. They just like power and control and basically giving benefits to the people who support them. And Mike says this ensured the colonies would remain a resource provider and not a manufacturer in their own right. Now, Jefferson called all of these acts of regulation and prohibition, again, interference with the natural right of free trade, but he also referred to them in a precursor to nullification. We think Jefferson just came up with this word in 1798, considering that a sovereign state could declare an act null and void and of no force, and that was just brand new and it was nuts. But this is from the principles of the American Revolution, and Jefferson discussed something being a nullity and declaring it void on a colony level all the way back in 1774. He said, "We do not point out to His Majesty the injustice of these acts with intent to rest on that principle, the cause of their nullity." So TLDR, he's just saying, he's gone through explaining all the problems with the acts, but he's not saying, hey, just because what you've done has had bad results, it's null and void. They're null and void because you're not authorized to do it in the first place. And that's how he continues. Again, we're not just explaining the problems to say that that's the principle for what their nullity is, but to show that experience confirms the propriety of those political principles which exempt us from the jurisdiction of the British Parliament. He's taking the position, Jefferson was the most radical possibly at the time, saying British Parliament had no authority over the colonies and even their external trade at all. Zero. James Madison agreed with him, and I'll get to that in a moment. He said, "The true ground on which we declare these acts void is that the British Parliament has no right to exercise authority over us at all. Period." That's how Jefferson put it. And also, James Madison agreed with this take. In his report of 1800, Madison argued, just like Jefferson did some decades earlier, that these external regulations on trade were unconstitutional right from the beginning. But they still went along with them. You'll hear here's Madison's words. "There was a time indeed when an exception to the legislative separation of the several component and co-equal parts of the empire obtained a degree of acquiescence." So he's saying, look, we went along with it, but that doesn't mean it was okay. He said the British Parliament was allowed to regulate the trade with foreign nations and between the different parts of the empire. This was, however, mere practice without right and contrary to the true theory of the Constitution. And again, the Constitution meaning the unwritten British Constitution, but the traditions of how things had been operating all along. And then starting in 1651, things really started to shift pretty aggressively. They started to ramp up as I went through a number of those acts. Now, you may be thinking, okay, Bolden, this is interesting stuff, but where am I going to be? You're going through this so quickly, I can't even keep up with it. Well, I am really, really plowing through this pretty fast. So every episode, a couple of hours after the live stream is done, Alan Mosley gets a blog post organized where it has not only just all the different platforms we're on. Of course, we live stream on all the mainstream ones like X and YouTube and Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitch. We also live stream at Rumble and Odyssey and archive the video all over the place. We have a podcast edition on basically all the major and a bunch of the smaller platforms. But for every blog post over at 10thAmendmentCenter.com/path-to-liberty, there's also a show links section. So if you're thinking, okay, where can I read Jefferson's take? Where's this Iron Act of 1750, etc., etc., it'll all be linked to in the show notes section of the blog post for this episode. 10thAmendmentCenter.com/path-to-liberty. And while I'm here, I want to take a quick moment and say hello to everyone out in the live chat. I appreciate you being here. Whether you're joining us for your first time or you've been here for every single one since day one, I can't thank you enough. There's Dixie and Greenbottle and Howard and Alexis and Harvest, Mary Moon, Jennifer, Rights Are Not Tradition, Alan, Elsa, good to see you, Glenn, and a number of other people. Again, thank you so much for spending some of your time with me today. I hope you find this interesting, at least so far. I'm doing my best to take this, well, the stuff that the government-run schools really just ignore, because I think it gives us a bigger picture of what the problem was, how they solved it, and maybe it'll give us some ideas of what the problems are today and how to solve them once again today as well. But let's get right back to this. Again, thanks for being here. Back to Mike Meharry. He points out that whether Jefferson and Madison, whether their opinions on the constitutionality of the trade restrictions, the external trade, the external taxes, of course, we know many of the other old revolutionaries also just said, hey, you guys could basically do that, or they're acquiescing. But as soon as you start doing internal stuff and we have no representatives, then that's the problem. But Jefferson and Madison, it wasn't about just having representation. And certainly, even if they weren't the unanimous view, but they had a very popular view of the time as well. So whether those views on the constitutionality of these trade restrictions were widely accepted or not, we don't even have to address that part. In practice, we know the level of smuggling shows that many people were opposed to them and were willing to take risks to defy them. They saw them as, well, unjust or something that was causing significant hardship, so they had to go through the trouble of violating those rules. Mike points out that the Molasses Act, for example, was largely defied by the colonists. Smuggling to avoid it was prominent, and as a result, the tax was often not paid. This resistance effectively nullified the law in practice, and that's just how John C. Miller put it in his book in the 1940s, Origins of the American Revolution. He called the resistance and opposition to the Molasses Act an act of nullification by the colonists. He said, against the Molasses Act, Americans had only their smugglers to depend upon, because the argument was taken that if the tax was aggressively collected, many American businesses would be shut down. They wouldn't be able to survive. But he says these redoubtable gentry proved more than a match for the British. After a brief effort to enforce the act in Massachusetts in the 1740s, the English government tacitly accepted defeat, and foreign molasses was smuggled into the northern colonies in an ever-increasing quantity. Thus, the New England merchants survived, but only by nullifying an act of Parliament. So nullification, nothing new. It's part of the American Revolution. And as pointed out here by James A. Northington at, I think it's Penn State University Library's website, the Iron Act faced the same kind of resistance as well. He said, despite the rigorous identification efforts of the Iron Act, so they did all kinds of, well, we would call it mass warrantless surveillance of today, The law was widely ignored due to loose enforcement from both local governing and local British officials. So the local people like the sheriffs and the local custom officers, and then the British officials who were living locally were very lax in their enforcement. I think it was, at least from my reading, it was just because so many people were just defying it, or many of the local sheriffs just weren't on board. So that gives us some insight. Well, we got to get more sheriffs on board with non-enforcing stuff that they shouldn't be enforcing, things that are a violation of the Constitution. That would be a really good step forward for the Constitution and liberty today. And James puts it like this. After sheriffs completed their searches to identify primary iron manufacturing plants, so stuff that the British were saying couldn't exist, little was done to keep their production in check. Thus, the Iron Act of 1750 was generally ignored by the colonists. So instead of restricting iron production in the colonies, the passing of the Iron Act led to a rising feeling of ill will and defiance against England, feelings which would evolve in the coming years to fuel the American Revolution and the War for Independence, which followed that revolution. Now, it's also interesting to understand as you can read through James's full article, Forging a Revolution, John Taylor et cetera. He also discusses how, well, people got kind of creative. If they were restricted in doing this type of production, they found new ways, more efficient ways to manufacture things, and it created kind of an evolution in the marketplace as well. So we'll see how creative merchants have to do things to get around government restrictions. George Smith puts it like this. As a result of salutary neglect, smuggling was rampant in the colonies, or it could be the other way around. Smuggling was rampant, so the enforcement was mostly neglected. We don't really, I guess it depends on how you're reading all that. And most Americans, he writes, saw nothing wrong with smuggling. It was an honorable profession. They did not look kindly on government interference with their commercial activities. They agreed with Thomas Jefferson that free trade is a natural right. So this was the general view. We've always been able to trade with the whole world, and now you're telling us we can't, and we can tell that it's only to benefit your friends and partners locally. So you don't like us competing with you, so you're going to try to shut us down? Oh, that's going to cause all kinds of resentment. And George goes on with this. For example, in 1756 and 57, some 400 chests of tea were imported into Philadelphia, but only 16 of 400 were imported legally. So a huge majority. I went to government-run school, so math is not my strong point, especially without my phone handy. What is that, like 90%? This is a huge percentage of the tea imported into Philadelphia between 1756 and 57 were all smuggled. He said, indeed, 3/4 or more of the tea consumed by Americans was illegal all through the colonies. In 1763, the British government estimated that the value of commodities smuggled into the colonies at £700,000 annually, an enormous sum at the time. And of course, all these trade restrictions and all the smuggling that was going on with it told the British that the only thing that they really needed to do was not back off on the restrictions, that they're, facing massive resistance, that the people hate them, they're not going to comply. They just think, well, what does government do? They see everything as a nail, and they think that they are the hammer. So, of course, they want to restrict it even further. They led to enforcement actions, more surveillance. I'll get to that in just a moment. Mike Meharry puts it like this. To try to stem the flow, the British sent customs agents to the colonies armed with things called writs of assistance. These were essentially open-ended search warrants authorizing the holder to search businesses and private homes for smuggled goods. Massive, your home is not your castle anymore. Of course, James Otis Jr. responded to these in 1761, said a man's home is his castle. You can't just show up and look for things because you tell us without specifying in the warrant what you're searching for, who and why. You're just going to show up and say, well, I'm armed with this, and it doesn't expire. That's the point. Writs of assistance did not require any specification about the place to be searched or what types of goods the agents were looking for. They never expired until a king died. Like, literally, if they were issued under one reign, they would be valid until that dude was gone. And they were considered a valid substitute for specific search warrants, and they were also transferable. The Navigation Act, the last one of those major ones in 1696, opened the door for these writs of assistance to be used in the colonies. And again, James Otis Jr. railed against these writs of assistance in his great speech in 1761. John Adams later said that then and there American independence was born. But here, back to Rothbard, again, how he put it. This network of regulation and its enforcement built up the state bureaucracy as well as national and imperial power. And you can see how this is playing out. Add a regulation, people defy it. Add another regulation, people defy it. Start searching people's homes. People don't like that too much either. And it keeps getting more and more tense. It's not just taxation without representation. So we have many more. Of course, the Molasses Act was set to expire in 1763. At least it had an expiration date. There's something to that. But they never stop. Once government gets a precedent, we know they will always expand and expand and expand. As Abigail Adams put it, power, whether vested in many or a few, is ever grasping. She says, like the grave, it cries, give, give, give. So it's always trying to expand and grow. So once they had this power, they shouldn't have been surprised that they were going to do more and more and more. Now, when passed by Parliament, this is from Wiki, the new Sugar Act of 1764, this was basically the follow-up act to the Molasses Act. It halved the previous tax on molasses. Let's throw them a bone. We're cutting back some of the tax. In addition to promising stricter enforcement, the language of the bill made it clear that the purpose of the legislation was not to simply regulate the trade, as the Molasses Act had attempted to do, but specifically to raise revenue. Now, this sounds like the arguments that we heard surrounding the Affordable Care Act. These are the same old imperial policies and approaches for these things. And of course, we had much more resistance back then than we do today. Now, the new act listed specific goods, the most important being lumber in the Sugar Act, which could only be exported to Britain. Hear from Jane Triber, a historian writing for the National Park Service. She points out that the Sugar Act also taxed numerous foreign products, including wine, coffee, and textiles, and banned direct shipment of several important commodities, such as lumber, to Europe, upsetting the balance of trade for merchants in northern seaports. And if you think about it at the time, this is 1764, banning the export of lumber. This is a huge part of the livelihood of the people. Now, the British weren't really interested in what was going on in the colonies. They just kind of took a very laissez-faire approach until they started getting rich. And then, of course, they want to get their filthy little hands in on it, just like we see today. Anyways, Jane continues. More than half the articles in the Sugar Act dealt with enforcement. So what they did was they threw a little bone. They made it look like they were reducing a tax by half, but they added all kinds of other restrictions and prohibitions. But even more so, they added a lot of enforcement actions as well. Now, Samuel Adams, writing in 1764, Instructions to the Representatives of Boston, he puts it like this. This is a little bit more on the Sugar Act first. Ship captains were required to maintain detailed manifests of their cargo, and papers were subject to verification before anything could be unloaded from the ships. This was very unusual. We probably think, okay, we're just going to validate what your cargo is. That's fine. But back then, they were not cool with having to show papers of just shipping products to another country. Customs officials were empowered to have all violations tried in vice admiralty courts rather than by jury trials. So they eliminated jury trials, which is a big part of the complaints, the grievances of the American Revolution. It was a big part of the concerns of the Anti-Federalists under the original Constitution. Oh, well, how are we going to have trial by jury? This was a big motivator to have a Bill of Rights. So they wanted all violations in vice admiralty courts rather than jury trials in local colonial courts, where the juries generally looked favorably on smuggling as a profession. Oh, you were just smuggling? Well, I'm going to use jury nullification. Maybe that's not the thought process that went through each individual's mind, but that's certainly how it would have played out in practice. I think the British understood this, which is why they were like, we can't have jury trials with those rabble-rousers. They're just going to tell us everybody's not guilty. So here's how Samuel Adams put it in 1764. For if our trade may be taxed, why not our lands? He's recognizing, like so many of the other founders did, so many of the other old revolutionaries, What so few people seem to think about today is that when you give somebody the precedent to do something, they will always do more and more and more. And that person, even if you trust the people that you're allowing to do something with power in government, even if you trust them, you think they're great people, they're not going to be there forever. Someone else is going to take that power and use it in ways that you never wanted them to. So if our trade may be taxed, why not our lands? Why not the produce of our lands? And everything we possess or make use of. This, we apprehend, annihilates our charter right to govern and tax ourselves. Now, Samuel Adams was one of the people who was basically taking a position that, well, you can't do this because we don't have representation in Parliament. He seemed to be a little bit less radical, the father of the American Revolution, than in 1764, at least, than Jefferson was in 1774, saying you don't have any power to do this whatsoever. And that's probably why the Continental Congress didn't unanimously approve that, but it still was published. Jefferson's take was approved and published pretty widely. Now, of course, the rest is history. Next, they expanded on that precedent that Samuel Adams was warning about, that we got the Stamp Act. Then we had the Declaratory Act when the colonists resisted and local officials didn't enforce the Stamp Act. This resulted in it not being enforced whatsoever. They nullified it in practice and effect. Murray Rothbard, in his great History of the American Revolution, Conceived in Liberty, which you should really try to check out. You can find it online for free probably over at Mises.org. But he called this the people's nullification of the Stamp Act. But the British, again, they never want to give up. This is what empires do. Even if they say, okay, we're going to get rid of this thing, they always want to slap back with something else. And they passed, at the same time they repealed the Stamp Act, they passed something called the Declaratory Act, which claimed power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. And then they followed up by using that, passing things known as the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act in 1773, etc. Here's how Thomas Jefferson described all of this. He said, "Scarcely have our minds been able to emerge from the astonishment into which one stroke of parliamentary thunder has involved us, before another more heavy and more alarming is fallen on us. Single acts of tyranny may be ascribed to the accidental opinion of a day, but a series of oppressions, begun at a distinguished period and pursued unalterably through every change of ministers, too plainly prove a deliberate and systematical plan of reducing us to slavery." In other words, total government control over the people. If it's done through various administrations, it never goes away, and they keep following up with more and more and more. And once you figure out that they're doing this thing, all of a sudden, once you focus on this one, they hit you with another and another and another. Again, I can't resist saying it, but it sure sounds like exactly what we've been living under, at least for my entire life as well. Now, each step by the British to implement and enforce all of these mercantilist policies, it was met by nullification. It was resistance, noncompliance, and the like. And James Madison described this back and forth in his report of 1800 as the fundamental principle of independence. And here's how he described it. If the deliberate exercise of dangerous powers, palpably withheld by the Constitution, discussing the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. He said if that could not justify the parties to it, that is, the people of the several states, in interposing even so far as to arrest the progress of the evil, and thereby to preserve the Constitution itself, as well as to provide for the safety of the parties to it, there would be an end to all relief from usurped power, and a direct subversion of the rights specified or recognized under all the state constitutions, as well as, get this, a plain denial of the fundamental principle on which our independence itself was declared. The fundamental principle on which our independence itself was declared to the father of the Constitution was the notion that, well, if they go beyond the limits of the power that they're authorized to exercise, it is the right and the duty of the people to defy and resist it, to arrest the progress of the evil, and to preserve the Constitution, at least in their own area. Despite what the federal government or the far off the British Parliament was doing, this was the fundamental principle which led to the American Revolution. Now, of course, we also see this a little bit, at least, in the Declaration of Independence. And here's how Jefferson put it. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction. Jefferson and others. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. And he goes through a bunch of things that Parliament passed that the king gave his assent, his royal assent to. That included for imposing taxes on us without our consent and for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world. Now, since government-run schools really just never teach this deep history, this foundational stuff, they, of course, don't teach us the real problem that they were facing and what they were complaining about and the solutions they used, things that we can think about and maybe try to apply as well today. The founding generation, the old revolutionaries, are one of the few peoples that we can really look at that really was successful against the great empire. So why don't we at least look to that and look at their solutions and problems in more detail? That's what we're trying to do here. So we think it's absolutely essential to get this kind of information out to more and more people, and nothing helps us roll up our sleeves every single day to do the research, the writing, the podcast, the production, the short videos, etc., the blogs, the articles. Nothing helps us do this work more every single day, more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. If you've got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. You can also help us spread the word with some free and easy peasy actions like smashing the like button, leaving reviews on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, comments, especially in the archives like on YouTube, etc., reposting on X. All those things can help trigger the algorithm, especially of the mainstream platforms, and tell them to show us to more people. We're reaching more and more people every single day, every single week. I'm so grateful for your support. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it made you think. I hope you learned something that's more important than anything. And I hope to see you next time here on the path to liberty.